time this evening.
Sorry about that.
Oh, no worries. And thank you so much, Rhiannon and the Millerton Library for hosting this. This is a belated Earth Day event. I'm super pleased to be here. We're going to talk about a subject that I am deeply passionate about. This is like shifting to a sustainable clean energy economy. And you know, I've been involved, I guess, in the climate fight for a long time now, almost probably around 3 decades. You know, beginning right out of college, when I worked at the United Nations Association during negotiations for the first framework convention on climate that was signed in 1992, and later pivoted to the way local level, serving in local government in the town of Rosendale and here in Ulster County, where I was working on a lot of local projects, climate projects. And I know you and Millerton, you all are making incredible progress. I hear you're about to be achieve bronze status as a climate smart community, which is incredible. You should all be very proud of that. When I was in the state Senate, we had this incredible opportunity to really move the needle on climate. And I worked very hard on and advocated for passage of the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, which we'll talk about a little bit later in this presentation. But it's going to take all of us working together at all levels, individual, local, state on up, to address the climate crisis and make the kinds of changes we need to make. The solutions exist, they exist, and we just have to implement them. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So I'm going to share my screen. And let's see. All right. This presentation has been developed by New Yorkers for Clean Power as an educational tool for the public. NYCP is a statewide collaborative campaign to shift to a clean energy economy. And I invite you all, if you're interested, to join our mailing list to keep up to date on developments in New York State and ways you can get involved. You can visit the website and learn more at www.nyforcleanpower.org. So we're going to, sorry about that, one of the few people with a landline still. I'm going to just start with a few key terms. Many of you are maybe familiar with these, but I just want to make sure we're all starting from the same place. So greenhouse gas emissions, these are emissions of carbon dioxide, methane, hydrofluorocarbons, which are commonly used in refrigerants and as a foaming agent, and other gases that trap heat in the atmosphere. Net zero greenhouse gas emissions is releasing no more greenhouse gases than we're able to sequester or store, preferably naturally in trees, soils, and the roots of plants. And in New York, as we'll talk about, we have a statutory mandate to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, reducing 85% of our greenhouse gas emissions, and we have to sequester the other 15%. When we talk about renewable energy, we're talking about energy that comes from natural sources that are constantly replenished, including solar, wind, hydropower, tidal and wave energy, and geothermal. And we'll be talking a bit about the electric grid. This is the power lines, substations, and other infrastructure that's used to move electricity from where it's generated to where it is used. And there are two main components of that, of our electricity system, our grid, and that's the transmission system, high voltage lines that carry electricity sometimes over great distances across the state, or shorter distances. and the distribution system, which is the local poles and wires you see that are a step down voltage that delivers electricity to our homes. So we're going to start just with the basics about fossil fuels. So fossil fuels, as you all know, powered the Industrial Revolution and continue to power the global economy, though the transition to clean energy is well underway because of the toll that our fossil fuel dependence has taken on climate, the environment, and public health. In the most basic terms, fossil fuels are the remains of dead organic life, such as plants or shellfish, which collect and build up over millions of years. These life forms breathe, eat, and store carbon when they're alive, and then are compressed in the earth, storing carbon along with them. And when fossil fuels are dug up and burned, those millions of years worth of carbon are rapidly released back in the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere have been rising dramatically since the Industrial Revolution, which is shown pretty starkly in this graph. By the way, just as a little piece of fossil fuel trivia, in 1821, William Hart dug the first natural gas well in the Industrial Revolution in the village of Fredonia, New York. So, and in 1858, the Fredonia Gas Light Company became the first American natural gas company. So the global fossil fuel economy got its start right here in our state. Now, I've mentioned carbon dioxide, but there are other important greenhouse gas emissions associated with fossil fuels besides carbon dioxide. And a big one is methane, which is emitted, it's emitted during the extraction process for fossil gas. It's constantly being emitted through the distribution system when it leaks out of old pipes. And it's emitted when it's combusted for electricity, and it's emitted in our homes when we combust it for cooking our food. Actually, even if we're not cooking our food, there was a recent study that just showed that found that 70% of methane emissions from our stoves happen when the stoves are off. But it's, you know, from our home heating systems and our appliances. The most recent report of the International Panel on Climate Change pointed specifically to methane as a key driver of the current rate of warming. Cutting emissions of methane, which is 86 times more potent a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide, is absolutely key to controlling climate change in the near term and to meeting New York's climate goals. So let's see here. So fossil fuels, they're bad for the climate, the environment, the economy, and public health. We're already unfortunately seeing the profound consequences of climate change. Last summer's heat waves in the Pacific Northwest were previously unfathomable. They were made 150 times more likely because of climate change. In March of this year, I'm sure you all read, the South Pole was 70 degrees warmer than usual, also previously unfathomable. And New York communities are very vulnerable to sea level rise. The Hudson River is projected to rise 4 feet in the next 60 years. Extreme heat days, severe storms, and flooding, among other consequences. And, you know, I'm sure just last fall, I'm sure you all read during Hurricane Ida, 11 people literally drowned in their own apartments and basement apartments in New York. So, you know, I know this all sounds very bleak, but we do have solutions, which we'll get to shortly. While climate change is certainly one of the most formidable consequences of our reliance on fossil fuels, it has other serious and adverse consequences for the environment as well, including water pollution from pipeline leaks, air pollution from emissions of fine particulates, sulfur dioxide, and other toxic pollutants. And this pollution takes a major toll on ecosystems as well as public health. Many health conditions are connected to fossil fuel related air pollution. Respiratory diseases such as emphysema and chronic bronchitis, cardiovascular disease, cancers, childhood illness such as asthma and ADHD, and others. Polluting fossil fuel infrastructure tends to be cited in poor and non-white communities, making fossil fuel generated air pollution a major environmental justice issue. The city of Newburgh, down in Orange County, has the highest rate of asthma in the state outside of New York City. So these inequalities exist right here in the Hudson Valley. And much of this is associated, by the way, with impacts on local outdoor air quality. But an accumulating body of research is suggests that, as I said, gas stoves, which are in almost all of our homes, can pose health risks if there is incomplete burning or inadequate venting. They emit fine particulates, formaldehyde, and carbon monoxide, all of which are obviously very bad for our health. There are also major costs to our dependence on fossil fuels. A recent analysis commissioned by NYSERDA as part of the planning process to implement our climate law estimates that the cost of our continued reliance on fossil fuels will exceed the cost of shifting to a clean energy economy by $90 billion by 2050. So we have no time to lose in shifting to a clean energy economy. The most recent assessment of the International Panel on Climate Change finds that climate change is already causing dangerous and widespread disruption in nature and affecting the lives of billions of people around the world. We have to make steep cuts in greenhouse gas emissions in the coming decades to prevent a rise in global mean temperatures to a level that greatly increases the risk of harm to us and to the planet. But the good news is that every bit of reduction in greenhouse gas emissions helps. And as I said before, the other good news is that we have solutions. Oh. So New York, as I mentioned, we passed the Climate Leadership Community Protection Act, which is the strongest climate law in the country. That act commits New York to reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 40% by 2030. That's just 8 years away. And as I mentioned, reaching net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. Sorry, this is a little slow, these slides. The law also requires that by 2030, we generate 70% of our electricity from renewable sources. And by 2040, we achieve an entirely carbon-free electricity system. So that means no more fossil generation. And importantly, at least 35% of the benefits of clean energy investments have to go to disadvantaged communities with the goal of 40%. A major thrust of New York's climate law is that our clean energy transition be a just and equitable transition. And actually, the Biden administration looked to New York's climate law when creating the Justice 40 initiative. It's like virtually word for word from New York's climate law. So how do we get there? Energy efficiency and conservation are the most cost-effective first steps because you're reducing use, which results in financial savings over time. Improving energy efficiency in your home or office includes everything from insulation and tightening the building envelope to using energy efficient appliances and LED lighting. The cleanest and cheapest energy, of course, is the energy we don't use at all. A second key element of the clean energy transition is to shift from fossil fuel combustion in our buildings and in transportation to efficient electricity-based technologies. For our buildings, this is shifting to heat pumps for heating and hot water, induction stoves for cooking, and heat pump dryers. And finally, we have to make sure that all of these electricity-based technologies are powered by clean, renewable energy rather than by fossil fuels. So in short, the strategy here in New York is to green the grid and electrify everything. I just want to mention that this is basically, these are the basic elements of New York's draft climate plan, which is currently open for public comment. It's very important that the public weigh into this document. It's the blueprint for achieving our climate goals. And at the end of the presentation, I'll provide a link to an online toolkit we've developed to help you make comments. And that public comment period ends on July 1. It was just extended, actually. So reaching New York's climate goals is going to require transformative changes. An analysis was done by the state for the climate action plan process and looked at different scenarios for meeting our goals. And among the conclusions across scenarios was that by 2030, we need to electrify between 1 and 2 million homes with heat pumps. We also have to replace 3 million gas vehicles on the road with electric vehicles by that time. These are extraordinary changes that we have to make in a very short amount of time to stay on track and meet our goals. Reaching our climate goals, though, has incredible benefits for our economy, for public health, and for the quality of life of New Yorkers beyond addressing the climate crisis. There was a jobs analysis done by the state, again, as part of this climate planning process, that found that if we, again, stay on target to reach our greenhouse gas emissions reduction goals, we could see a net gain of close to 190,000 jobs in New York by 2030. And by 2050, we could see a net gain of close to 270,000 jobs. That's an unprecedented number of jobs created in New York. I mean, that's like, equivalent to a wartime effort. So it's a huge boost to the economy. And beyond that, you have to think about the fact that, over half of what we spend on energy leaves the state to pay for fossil fuels. And this is money that we could be investing in our economy in New York, creating real energy security and real energy independence. Reaching our climate goals is also very good for the health of New Yorkers. According to the analysis of the state's draft climate plan, air quality improvements alone will avoid tens of thousands of premature deaths, thousands of non-fatal heart attacks, thousands of other hospitalizations, thousands of asthma-related emergency room visits, and hundreds of thousands of lost work days. We are projected to save between $50 and $120 billion in avoided health costs and impacts alone by shifting to a clean energy economy. So where are our emissions coming from? The leading sector of our emissions are our buildings, our built environment, and a very close second is transportation. Together, those two sectors account for 60% of our greenhouse gas emissions. Electricity is just 13%. We've actually made huge progress in reducing emissions in the electricity sector in recent years. But it is the linchpin of the clean energy transition, since we are, moving away from fossil fuels by shifting to electricity-based technologies. So it's absolutely key that we achieve a zero emissions grid. We're going to be focusing on these three sectors in this presentation: buildings, transportation, and electricity. But waste accounts for 12%. I will just tell you that The analysis for the state's climate plan found that we need to divert 100% of our waste from of our organic waste from landfills by 2030. So there's a lot of work to be done there as well. And again, we have solutions in that area as well. So we'll start with buildings. We have over 6 million buildings in New York. About 3/4 of them were built before there were any energy codes, and the vast majority of them rely on fossil fuels for heating, hot water, and appliances. And the vast majority of those buildings are single-family homes. Over 5 million of the buildings in New York are single-family. Energy and weatherization is a key step, not only to reducing emissions, but as I mentioned earlier, to saving money on your bills. If you own a home and you have not gotten a free energy audit, you should schedule one ASAP. You can just Google NYSERDA home energy assessment and find out more information about this free program. I got one for my home and it was incredibly helpful. They assess not just energy efficiency, but they also check for mold and proper ventilation. And you'll get a report with specific suggestions tailored to your home and actions you can take, and you can understand the payback on all of those investments. And it's just an incredible tool to empower you to make the improvements that will really benefit your home and your comfort and your wallet, hopefully. And if your income is below the median income level, New York's programs pay between 50 and 100% of the building improvements. So we're going to move on here. So in addition to improving building efficiency, the most important step is to shift to heat pumps for heating and hot water, which account, fossil fuels for heating and hot water account for the lion's share of direct building emissions. Heat pumps are super efficient. Rather than converting energy from one form to another, as fossil systems do, which involves, by the way, a lot of energy waste, heat pumps transfer heat from a cool space to a warm space. So during the heating system, heat pumps move heat from the outdoors or underground into your warm house. During the cooling season, heat pumps move heat from your house into the outdoors, cooling the house down. And that's another huge benefit of heat pumps. You get both heating and cooling from the same system. So you're replacing both your boiler, and if you have AC, your AC as well. In our communities, I think, I don't know about Millerton, but where I am, and in many rural communities, we don't have access to utility gas and rely on oil, propane, electric resistance heating. And switching to heat pumps makes huge economic sense, even if you didn't care about climate, which we hope you do. Air source systems can be either decentralized or centralized systems. This picture shows a mini split heat pump system with individual units for the different spaces to be heated and cooled. I have a big old Victorian house that requires 5 units. My mother has like a ranch style house that just needs 2 units. It's going to depend on the house itself or the business. These are cold climate systems that can heat a home in the coldest times in winter. There are also, if you have a ducted system in your house for central air or gas heat, you can also get a centralized heat pump system as pictured here. So those systems were air source heat pump systems. Ground source heat pump systems, also known as geothermal systems, are even more efficient than air source heat pump systems because they take advantage of relatively stable temperatures underground. Unlike air temperatures, which we know here in the Northeast are extremely variable. And during temperature extremes, air source heat pumps need to use comparatively more electricity to heat and cool compared to geothermal systems. Geothermal systems do, however, have a bigger upfront cost because you have to dig wells, for instance, which has a cost, but there are very big incentives. I believe Millerton is in Central Hudson Territory, like we are here, and I'll share these slides with you if you'd like, and the recording is also, you can have access to the recording, but you can also just get this information on Central Hudson's website. But there are major incentives for through Central Hudson for ground source heat pumps. And I actually want to mention, in addition to the utility incentives, just this year in the state budget, and a new state tax incentive for geothermal systems was passed as part of the budget, up to $5,000. So it's actually quite economical, much more economical than it's ever been to invest in a ground source heat pump system. And then air source heat pump systems, also deliver savings, serious annual savings. The paybacks on with current incentives from Central Hudson, the paybacks for air source system are an average of 8.2 years. It's going to depend, again, on the size of your house and the sizing of the system. Ground source heat pumps with incentives, the payback is around 6.2 years. If it's really important, if you're going to make the investment in heat pumps, to make sure that you are weatherizing your house. Again, this not only saves you money, just in operational costs, but it will reduce the size of the system that you need to heat and cool your home. So it's important to consider energy efficiency and the shift to heat pumps together. So I just want to talk, mention a few very key recommendations of the state's draft climate plan to meet its climate goals. As I mentioned, it's currently open for public comment. One is the passage of legislation. It's called the Advanced Building Codes and Appliance and Equipment Efficiency Standards Act. As an update, this actually passed both houses of the state legislature, and I imagine that the governor is going to sign it because she had originally included it in her budget proposal. It's going to enable building codes to be greatly strengthened. It requires that the Code Council take climate impacts into account. And it also includes appliance standards that will save New Yorkers an estimated $15 billion over 15 years. So this is a great savings to New Yorkers, great for the climate. The draft climate plan also calls, importantly, for a fossil fuel ban in new construction beginning in 2024. So basically, it's staggered. So by 2024, all residential and multifamily buildings under 5 stories would be required to be all electric. And again, we're talking about just new construction, not existing. And then by 2027, commercial buildings and multifamily buildings 5 stories above would be required to be all electric. This is really the low-hanging fruit. It's like there's virtual cost parity in upfront costs with new construction, and it just makes absolutely no sense to be building buildings that depend on fossil fuel combustion when we have to move away from fossil fuels. The plan also calls for a managed transition off of utility gas. About 65% of New York households depend upon utility gas. It's an integrated network and has to be coordinated very carefully. So this is a challenging but very important piece of it that the utilities are going to play a very important role in helping customers shift to electricity-based, more efficient electricity-based technologies. Okay, moving on to transportation, the second largest source of greenhouse gas emissions at 28%. So just starting with public transportation, this public transportation is, one of the important solutions to reduce emissions from the transportation sector. But access to it is spread very unevenly in different regions of New York State, with mass transit is concentrated, obviously, in urban centers. In New York City, for example, 60% of commuters rely on public transit, but 3/4 of New Yorkers in the rest of the state drive to work alone in a personal vehicle. I did want to mention the bipartisan infrastructure bill that was passed last year includes funding for rail and transit and public transit systems, and New York is expected to get about $10.5 billion out of from the infrastructure bill. So that's pretty significant. But, as I mentioned, by and large, New Yorkers get around by personal car. And as a result, 82% of transportation emissions in New York State come from light duty personal vehicles. So that's cars and SUVs and pickups and vans that are under 8,500 pounds. Of the over 9 million registered vehicles in New York, just 45,000 are zero emissions vehicles. So we have a lot of work to do. But I do want to mention there was a important legislation passed in December of last year that requires all sales and leases of new light duty vehicles in New York State to be zero emissions by 2035. And many the auto companies are already moving in this direction. GM has pledged to sell only zero emissions vehicles by 2035. They're all coming out with models like this is where the industry is going, but we have it in law in New York. And by the way, I drive a fully electric Chevy Bolt. I have since 2017, and it's the best car I've ever owned. I'm happy to talk about EV ownership if we have time toward the end. I just want to mention one other piece of important legislation that was passed as part of the budget this year. All school buses in New York State have to be electric by 2035. And by 2027, all new purchases of buses by school districts have to be electric. And the legislation makes it easier for school districts to finance the purchase of electric buses at the end of useful life of existing buses. And the Environmental Bond Act, which is going to be on the ballot in November, it provides $500 million in assistance to school buses to help make this transition. This is another one of these issues. It's good for the climate, but it's also really good for the health of our kids. More, of the diesel fumes leak into the into the cabins of the vehicles. It's a bigger problem than idling buses. And it obviously can impact our children's health and development. So this is it's hugely important that we shift to electric vehicles in our school buses. One way to reduce automobile emissions is simply to have fewer cars on the road. And communities are already undertaking innovative initiatives like bike share programs and car share programs. This tends to be in bigger areas or more urban areas, but it's an important part of the solution. And of course, a huge part of it is land use planning by local governments to make sure we're encouraging smart smart growth and transportation oriented development that, you know, supports walking, supports cycling, and doesn't contribute to sprawl. The EV, getting enough sort of EV charging infrastructure statewide is going to be really key to making the shift to electric vehicles. Municipalities can encourage adoption of EVs through the installation of charging stations and also by being a model and electrifying the municipal fleet. There are state rebate programs available to municipalities for both of these. I took advantage of them for my own town when I was on the town board. Got grants to install charging facilities downtown in our business district and at our town hall. You may have done it already if you're reaching bronze status, but if you haven't, I suggest you look into the rebate program. So this is a map. I just blew up the portion of the map that kind of covers our area, but you can see, you can get a sense of where EV infrastructure has been installed to date in our area. The green dots are publicly available chargers and the orange dots are high-speed chargers. So in transportation, in the transportation section of the draft climate plan, there are a number of key proposals. One big one is, or one challenge, I should say, is that EVs currently cost more than gas-powered vehicles. They're expected to reach cost parity by the end of the decade. But as I mentioned earlier, if we need 3 million EVs on the road before the end of the day or by the end of the decade, we have to be able to incentivize their purchase much better than we are right now. There is a proposal to create a fee bait and in the draft climate plan, and this would essentially put a fee on the purchase of, and this is just for new cars, leases of new cars. Well, I shouldn't say that. Well, I'll get back to that, but it's primarily new cars. It would impose a fee on fossil powered cars and the funds raised from that would be used to reduce the price of EVs to bring about closer cost parity between them. There would also be for low and moderate income consumers, it would apply to used cars as well, that incentive. Another important component of set of recommendations in the scoping plan is to electrify municipal transportation systems. For the state to work with municipal transportation systems on a schedule to convert their fleet. Here in Ulster County, we actually have started that process. We just purchased 3 electric buses, which is very exciting. And when I was in the Senate, I had gotten a grant so that we can power the charging of those buses with solar power. But this is going to be a really important piece of it. And of course, finally, we need to increase funding to municipalities to support more walkable and bikeable communities. So these are kind of the key areas of recommendations within the scoping plan. That plan, by the way, is a 330-page document that has many, many recommendations, but I pulled out some of the major ones. Okay, so moving on to the electricity sector. Electricity, as I mentioned, accounts for 13% of our emissions, but plays a particularly important role in the clean energy transition. New York currently relies on fossil fuels, mostly fossil gas, for 43% of our electricity. And we have to replace all of this with renewable energy. It will most likely mainly be wind and solar by 2040. Only about 5% of our electricity currently comes from wind and solar. There are, however, a lot of projects in the pipelines. They're under contract, and these include, 4.3 gigawatts of offshore wind. And when you include, all of the contracted resources, we're at about 50% right now renewable generation. It would put us at about 50% of the 70% that we have to reach by 70-30. So we're heading in the right direction, but projects need to get built. There is a huge disparity between upstate and downstate. The resource mix for electricity downstate, which includes us, our area, is 77% fossil fuels. While upstate, it is only 8% fossil fuels. And that's because upstate has a lot of legacy hydro, and also still relies on nuclear, which is considered zero emissions by the state. With the closure of Indian Point downstate, reliance on fossil gas in our zones have actually increased. In New York City, about 90% of the power currently comes from fossil fuels. But quite recently, 2 major transmission projects were approved, including one that's going to bring 1,250 megawatts of Canadian hydropower to New York City. It's the Champlain Hydropower Express, or Hudson Power Express. It was it was somewhat of a controversial project, but together with the access to those hydro resources and offshore wind that's currently under contract, New York City's grid is projected to be 80% renewable by 2030. So just quickly going through the main resources, there's the main renewable resources. We have large scale and small scale hydro. We're not likely to see any new large scale hydro projects in New York, though there is room for growth of small scale, low impact hydro projects. Wind power is a plentiful renewable resource in the state, and we've hardly scratched the surface in terms of both our onshore and offshore wind potential. Just 3% of it, of our current electricity, comes from wind. All of it's land-based. But as I mentioned, actually the climate legislation that we passed set a goal of 9,000 megawatts of offshore wind by 2035. And we have almost half of that under contract right now. And it's moving forward. The price of solar is definitely going to be the area of most growth, because the price of solar has come down so dramatically, by 80% in the last 10 years. Most of the utility scale renewable projects in the queue in New York are solar projects. There are 2 types of solar resources, 2 broad categories. There's utility scale and distributed solar. Utility scale are, large scale projects that generate enough electricity to power thousands of homes, and they're connected to the transmission system. So it can carry that electricity great distances, including from upstate to downstate. The scale of these utility scale projects, the size, are 25 megawatts or greater. Just for reference, 1 megawatt takes about 5 or 6 acres. So a 25 megawatt project can take up about 150 acres of land. And these projects are often much larger. They can be 60, 100, or 200 megawatts in size. So very, very large and land intensive. There is a huge untapped potential for agrivoltaics in New York, which can help minimize the trade-off among competing land uses. It's basically co-locating solar or wind. It could be with agricultural production. Other countries where land is much more scarce, like Germany and Japan, are much further down the road in agrivoltaics. It's still very much in the early stages here. And the predominant agricultural activity in New York has been co-locating sheep grazing with solar. There are currently about 1,000 acres of solar in New York that include sheep grazing. But you know, there's like huge potential for cultivating crops on solar sites, for beekeeping and for other agricultural activities. So distributed solar systems are much smaller than utility scale. They're connected to the local distribution system. That's why they're called distributed. They can be on rooftops, in yards, or on canopies over parking lots, or they can be in, green fields, like a lot of the community distributed generation projects. Many people have taken advantage of solar for their homes. It reduces their electricity bills. And as we shift to electric-based technologies like heat pumps, it becomes all the more beneficial from an economic perspective to site solar on your home. And then if it's paired with battery storage, which we're hoping the price comes down for that, it's going to greatly improve resilience during power outages, which is clearly a huge benefit. There is lots of untapped rooftop potential in New York State, and this is actually a big focus of New York's new distributed solar plan. There are much bigger incentives now for siting on commercial rooftops, but there's just millions and millions of square feet of warehouses in the Hudson Valley, for instance. There's an Amazon warehouse in Orange County that is 1 million square feet, and that rooftop should be blanketed with solar panels. So not all of us can put solar panels on our homes and businesses, and buildings may not be sited for it, or you may rent your home, or you may not be able to afford the upfront costs of solar. So community renewable generation is meant to provide wider access to the benefits of renewable energy. It enables residents and businesses to participate in a renewable project at another location. And the energy generated from those projects feeds into the local distribution system or the local grid. New York currently leads the nation in community solar development. When you subscribe to a solar project, you typically save about 10% on your utility bills. Plus, you are supporting local renewable energy and the economic benefits that can bring. So solar and wind are intermittent resources. They're not producing a constant amount of electricity around the clock. So we need storage systems to hold excess electricity generated from renewable sources and deploy it to the grid when those resources are generating less power. As of 2019, the state had over 700 megawatts of storage ready to build, and nearly 10,000 megawatts waiting for approval. It's projected that we will need about 15,000 megawatts of storage by 2040 to support a zero emissions grid. And by 2050, with our growth and dependence on electricity-based technologies in other sectors, we'll need about 20,000 megawatts of storage. So it's important to mention that we're seeing mounting opposition across the state in the siting of solar and wind. There can be really good reasons not to site a project at a particular location or to modify the original design. But in many cases, the objection to the projects is that people they don't want to look at them. They don't want to look at solar panels. They don't want to look at wind turbines. But we face a very difficult reality. If every community rejects projects for this reason, we are not going to be able to generate enough renewable energy to meet our goals. There's also a real equity issue here. You know, all of the fossil generation has pretty much been built in Black and brown communities and low income communities that had no power to prevent those projects from being constructed. And they are far more damaging to public health than renewables. And those communities have disproportionately suffered the harms of that infrastructure. So, you know, these are larger equity issues as well. If you're, you know, I think it's very important that states kind of proactively engage in the process of siting renewables. And, you know, and I think it's important for the state to be partnering with communities. If your community is interested, and you may have already done this, I don't know, but I highly recommend participating in the solar mapping workshops that are sponsored, that they're being sponsored by Clearwater and New Yorkers for Clean Power, to help communities plan for solar. They're utilizing Scenic Hudson's fantastic mapping tool that helps make planning easier. So I definitely recommend that. So as I mentioned at the beginning, the transition to a clean energy economy is going to create hundreds of thousands of green jobs potentially. And, you know, these are going to be in, you know, energy efficiency and renewable installations. They're going to be in manufacturing. They're going to be in different types of jobs associated with planning, design, architecture, engineering, and other specialties. New Yorkers for Clean Power has created a clean jobs map. This is an image of it, and a listserv for green jobs opportunities, businesses, and trainings. You can visit that map on our website if you are interested in a green jobs career or know of folks that might be interested in one. And last, I leave you with the message to get involved if you are not already. It's going to take every one of us working together to shift to a clean energy economy, to reduce the severity of climate change and protect our health and well-being and the well-being of our children. So, you know, who can't be on board with that? This slide has a list of various, you know, types of actions that you can take. I want to encourage you to weigh in on the state's draft scoping plan, its draft climate plan to reach our goals. It's an incredibly important document that's going to affect legislation and decision-making by every state government department and agency for years to come. You can check out our toolkit for public comment on our website, nyforcleanpower.org, and you know, it walks you through the steps of submitting comments. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I don't know if anyone has any questions. You could feel free to put them into chat or unmute, and just go ahead and ask Jennifer.
Hi, this is Delora Brooks. Can you hear me? I just lost my internet for the last few minutes of your.
Oh no.
Yeah, you know, that's what happens when you live here. I am going full as hard as I can with providing more solar energy for the property that I live at.
Oh,
and
fantastic.
I'm trying to put a new roof on my garage and my outbuildings so that I can put up more panels. What I'm really concerned about is economically, our community is more impoverished probably than other communities, you know, around the state. And I always wondered the extra energy that I make, which goes back into the grid. I don't want it to go to New York City. I really don't.
It won't. If it goes onto your local grid, it's just staying on your local grid. It's not going on the transmission system. So okay. It's staying.
There's a lot of people here. We're very tight with being able to meet our utilities this year. It's been horrible. And I'm glad to hear that. because I was under the assumption that since Indian Point went down or is gone, that we were trying to support other communities south of us. The other question I have is, I have like a surplus of almost $2,000 on my electric bill now. And we've done this for 1 year. I'm still trying to do the basics. Don't use a dryer. Yeah, I'm really roughing
Right.
it, trying to see how much
That's
of an effect.
great.
So we did that. That was old school. Hang your clothes on the line. So what?
Yep, I do it too.
They smell better. But
And last longer. They
they
last a
last longer
lot
too.
longer.
So, and it only takes a few minutes. But how do you go about getting a battery? Because I really would like to start storing some things. Like I want to get a electric vehicle by 2030.
Yeah, yeah. Well, there's this, our cars are going to become storage systems essentially. And the Ford F-150 electric, that it
I'm
is it's your house's storage system, basically. I wish I could somehow, I have to, I have heard of people in other parts of the country converting their somehow making it possible to use their electric cars to do the same. I would love to do that for mine, but the home battery prices need to come down. They exist, but they're costly. But if you can afford them, and you said you have a solar array, but you don't have battery backup for your solar.
And I've got a lot going on with this house, but I've been trying to do, even the guy that approved the batteries for the house, the panels, he told me, look at hydrogen batteries. So I don't even know or where to look to see what the best kind of battery would be. I got a government subsidy of around $37,000 to do the project that I did.
Yeah.
And it's $150 a month, but it's better than my electric bill.
Yeah.
So-
I just know, I have friends locally that got a battery backup when they installed their solar system, and it's been great. We have power. I'm in a very rural area, and our power goes out not infrequently, unfortunately. But anyway, and it gets them through that. And I don't know about like retrofitting a solar system. Maybe somebody else on this call might have that knowledge, but
it's not, I don't think it's the affordability. I know that it can happen because I had somebody walk me through it a little bit, but
yeah,
they helped you get halfway there. I wish there was help getting the rest of the way there. I can't find any, grant money or anything that's designed for that part of the, conversion. I was just wondering.
Let me point you toward, we have free clean energy advisors and New Yorkers for clean power. You can, if you, again, go to our website, you can ask a question or sign up to have a conversation with one of our free clean energy advisors. If they don't have the answer, they will research it for you and get back to you about it. So check that out on our website, nyforcleanpower.org. And I see somebody asked about induction cooktops. Any leads for getting, we made the switch in my household 2 years ago to induction. And I live in an old house. It had an old stove with incomplete combustion. And all I can say is, thank goodness it's not a super tight house, or I'd probably suffer some serious health consequences because but anyway, I love that's the stove. They are more expensive. And I've been trying to push NYSERDA to develop incentives to offer incentives to make the switch to induction stoves, because there are such huge health benefits. Like, they really adversely impact indoor air quality if there's not proper venting in a house. and if there's incomplete combustion, which is the case with a lot of old stoves. But they cook much better. They're much safer. You cannot, there's no flame. You can't, burn yourself. I mean, they're just, for many reasons, they're much better. They're super efficient. But I have an LG, I believe, induction stove, but I think that was the most competitively priced one at the time. But I strongly encourage people to make the switch if they can afford to make that switch. I also made the switch to a heat pump dryer, by the way, too, which is great. Although I hang my clothes as a lot mostly, but every once in a while you need a dryer, and it works great.
Jen, I'm wondering what is the biggest roadblock at the moment toward achieving the goals that are in the legislation? Is it? I keep hearing that it might be the grid, updating the grid, and that being a particularly difficult thing to do. Is that correct, or?
No, I mean, it depends what you're talking about.
Mhm.
What there is no reason why we could not adopt the recommendation, and there was legislation that would do this. And in fact, Kathy Hochul had even, put it in her budget, but it got kicked out, to enact the recommendation that I mentioned for new construction, all electric new construction. There is no reason not to do that. And there's no reason from a grid perspective. There's, it's entirely doable, but there was extreme lobbying by the fossil fuel industry that blocked that legislation from advancing this year in the legislature, unfortunately. But that, as I said, is the lowest hanging fruit. And there's also, I didn't mention it because there's only so much time, but there's another set of recommendations later that are the time frame would be, from 2030 to 2035, for to establish zero emissions standards for home heating, basically for fossil systems and appliances at the end of useful life. So, at the end, when your boiler breaks, you would shift to a heat pump system rather than continue buying a new boiler. And that's between 2030 and 2040. We will have 70% of the grid will be renewable by that time. We'll have a lot more storage. I didn't mention this, but so in New York State, we have a clean energy standard. We've had it since 2015. It was updated when we passed the climate law to be aligned with our renewable grid goals. But it requires utilities and energy supply companies to procure increasing amounts of renewable energy over time. They're required. It's a mandate. They have to do it. And one of the recommendations in the scoping plan is to create, either expand the clean energy standard to storage, or create a separate standalone storage standard, so that utilities are constantly increasing their investments in supporting storage as well, because storage is key. And it has to go hand in hand, and that's like the reliability piece of it. But we're not projected to shift to a winter peaking system until 2035. We have to make sure that we have the resources in place, the grid resources in place to support that shift to a winter peaking system.
Okay, thank you.
And I see we're going over just a little bit, but we had like one more question in chat.
Sure.
So, okay, great. Let's see. The draft climate plan calls for a fossil fuel ban and new construction starting in 2024. There was a big push in the last few weeks to help pass the All-Electric Building Act. It did not pass or was not voted on. Are both these bills designed to do basically the same thing?
They are. The scoping plan, I shared that recommendation. It sort of staggers it over 20, it's in two phases. 2024 would just apply to residential buildings under 5 stories and single family homes. And then in 2027, the rest of the buildings would be required to be all electric, or new construction of commercial buildings and those other buildings to be all electric. The All Electric Buildings Act, at least as it was originally proposed, would have everything happen in 2024. But it would give localities, local jurisdictions, the authority to determine whether it was technically feasible. To me, that is a flaw of the bill. Local jurisdictions don't have that's what a codes council is for. That's why we have a codes council, and they don't have the expertise to make those kinds of determinations. I think the bill was being revised over time, I think, to make it more consistent with, to address some of those issues, but it is essentially the same thing. And it didn't pass because of lobbying by the trade unions aligned with the utilities and fossil fuel industry. So that's the primary reason. So it's important to weigh in on that again in public comment. It's helpful to show support for that because, and the jobs thing, utilities in the gas industry, pipe fitters, they're justifiably worried about their jobs. These are jobs that are going away. Fossil fuel jobs are going away. We don't have a ton of them in New York, but we do have, they are in the thousands, and these are people's real lives. So, we have to make sure that we have the workforce development, retraining. We have to start that process now so that, these workers have the skills to transition into clean energy industries. But a lot of those skills are transferable. Pipe fitters are needed to install geothermal systems. And there was actually a bill that would enable utilities to install district or community geothermal systems, which I was a big supporter of. I was actually working on that legislation when I was in the Senate, and I was happy to see that somebody got it in and it passed both houses this year. It makes economic sense to in more densely populated areas as a replacement for a gas system to have shared geothermal systems.
Okay, well, I thought I heard another question coming in. Okay, well, thank you so much for joining us tonight. This was an amazing presentation. I really appreciate it. And if anyone wants to learn more, go to nyforcleanpower.org as well as climatesmartmillerton.org. Okay, thank you so much.
Sure, and congrats again on your climate work in Millerton. Very impressive. Take care.
Have a good night.
You too. Bye-bye.